Good afternoon. Welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag. My name is Eileen Burke, and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. These brown bags are supported by your membership in the Preservation Association of Lincoln. We encourage you to join to support these activities. To join online, you can go to preservelincoln.org. The videotaping today is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Nebraska State Historical Society in the City of Lincoln, a certified local government. Our speaker today is Ed Zimmer. Ed is the City of Lincoln Preservation Planner, a position that he's held for 26 years. Before coming to Lincoln, Ed was a freelance architectural historian in Boston. He is native to Omaha, Nebraska, and has an undergraduate degree from Lindenwood College and a PhD from Boston University. Ed's talk today is titled Ernst Herminghaus in the Woodsshire Subdivision. Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
A couple weeks ago, for the Preservation Association, I gave a walking tour in Woodsshire as well, and I believe that program, as well as this one, will be broadcasting on Channel 5, so we'll have a period when we're all Woodsshire all the time, and we can look forward to that. That will have some better photography in it, because we had some great photographers along on that program, and those will be incorporated into the walking tour. What I want to give background on today is both Woodsshire and its very special designer, Ernst Herminghaus. And so I'll start with Mr. Herminghaus, who was a Lincoln native, born in 1890, son of German immigrants. His father was a cigar maker in Lincoln. And Ernst attended Lincoln High School and then University of Nebraska, where he took a broad general liberal arts education with emphasis in horticulture. And this is his Cornhusker yearbook photo, and I love that with the little eyepiece in place. I didn't have one of those in any of my yearbook photos. This was his father's cigar manufacturing location, not the whole building. This, of course, is the First National Bank building, now called Lincoln Building, at 10th and O Streets of 1910, and it had basement shops along with the vaults for the bank in the basement. And on that 10th Street side was a staircase down to the basement barber shop and cigar manufacturing, and that's where Herminghaus's father had his cigar shop, at least for a time. If you walk by that 10th Street side of the Lincoln Building and look very closely at the polished granite lower story, you can see still the scars of the railing that was attached for that basement staircase. So the very subtle signs of Herminghaus influence. Herminghaus went from University of Nebraska to Harvard Graduate School of Design, and there studied and became the first academically trained landscape architect from Nebraska. And in 1915, graduated and came back to Lincoln. One of his earliest projects was the new formal entrance to Antelope Park. We can pretend this is familiar to us, but that would be quite a stretch. This is the O Street entrance to Antelope Park, if you can picture. O Street in the foreground with a very formal entryway up to where it starts to expand into the park features. Incorporated in that entryway, Herminghaus used for the first time in Lincoln the Robert Mills ionic columns from the U.S. Treasury Building in Washington, D.C. Those had been sandstone columns when that building was built in the 1830s and were replaced with granite around the turn of the last century. And a few of those columns were salvaged, and the only ones we know that still exist are the ones that were shipped off to Lincoln, Nebraska as a gift to William Jennings Bryan. And the columns were used, and those are the tall neoclassical ionic columns that Herminghaus incorporated into this formal entrance to Antelope Park. If you recognize those at all, they're the ones out at Pioneers Park that were reestablished there, I believe, in about 1976 as a bicentennial project. This was the replacement set of columns. These are the granite columns that replaced the original sandstone ones that we have in Lincoln on the east face of the Treasury Building. Just to zero in a little bit on where that feature was, this is a 1941 aerial photograph with O Street up at the north, and there was the Antelope Park entrance, and down at the bottom, just for orientation, is Lincoln High School. So that narrow stretch of Antelope Park that mostly now survives as the ball fields going up towards N Street was what he had the grand entrance to. And we can see in this close-up the shadows cast across O Street by what look like pine trees or something very conical planted along the face of that O Street front. Now, prepare for a shock, because I'll put this in the modern context, and then we'll move right on, because I don't want to sully this too long. The former entrance, this a few years ago when Cookland Pool was still in place. Now, of course, this is where Antelope Creek has been reopened, and that's the entrance to, that's the Herminghaus entrance to Antelope Park. Right beside it, and ironically photographed beside it in the 1923 book that I drew the entrance photo from, was the building where Lincoln Auto and Tractor School and Lincoln Airplane School had their classes. And this will have a Woodsshire connection when I get a little further along. That was not just trucks and autos, but also where you could learn to fly. And that has a very direct Woodsshire connection in a minute. That's this building. Another very early project of young Herminghaus, returned to Lincoln, was working for Harvey Rathbone in his big addition to the original Woods Brothers subdivision of Sheridan Boulevard. Woods Brothers had started Sheridan at the top of the boulevard at South Street in 1909 and had begun that diagonal boulevard stretching across the high ridge of land that led on down to College View. Rathbone did the second major addition to it in 1916, and that would be 27th Street on your left and about 31st on the right, and you can see the wider boulevard coming down the middle with the nearly parallel streets of Mance and Stratford lining it. And this drawing is signed by Herminghaus. How much he contributed to the overall layout and how much he was just adding the landscaping, I don't know for sure. But there's his signature or his name up at the upper left with Tell Nicolette, who was a young classmate from Harvard who had also come to Lincoln with Herminghaus in those very first years. It could be that Rathbone, in using Nicolette and Herminghaus, is consciously competing with the Woodses, who had just, in 1916, subdivided Woods Crest as their second piece of the Sheridan development, and they used Jens Jensen, very prominent landscape architect from Chicago, for all of that beautiful Woods Crest development. And also, Frank Woods used Jensen for his own grounds, the lot number 1, which now is the Haruz's house there at 2501 Sheridan Boulevard. A little bit that we can see in this 30s photo of the Nicolette and Herminghaus development in the Rathbone portion of Sheridan Boulevard, looking down the streetcar line that ran along the median, and both on the left-hand side in a very low-trimmed form, and on the right-hand side we see some of those border hedges that lined the curb and the sidewalks and the front front edges of the houses along Sheridan and the secondary streets. See those off on the right. And those were the ones in the front of the house that now Joel and Kathy Sartori have, and maintain that full set of privet hedges along the curbs and sidewalks. And we also see them at Bradford and Sheridan in this beautiful low trimmed form. Another of the very early projects in here, I'm not sure we had Herminghaus, but I know we had Nicolette, was Mr. Snell's house at 33rd and Randolph, designed by Fisk and McGinnis, or Fisk and Miller, I think in this early time. Nathaniel Snell was an auto dealer and had a nice built-in garage incorporated into the north side of his house. And these are the F.C. Fisk drawings for that beautiful house. And then Tell Nicolette's landscape scheme to go with it. It was a pair of houses, father and daughter. Down on the corner was the big house, and up above it a smaller related property, and then the landscape tied the two of them together. And we can see some of the features of the back drive and service court, the garage built into the house, which is now the pottery studio of the current occupants of the house, and then a vegetable and flower garden, another back garden in the upper house. I particularly like, I don't think I exactly have a drying lawn in my backyard, but I guess that's where you hung the clothes. Now moving to the specific neighborhood I'll talk about today, before there was Woodsshire, there was Axtell Heights. The Woods brothers were laying out subdivisions kind of moving south from their properties on Sheridan Boulevard, and Axtell Heights was the portion immediately south of Van Dorn up to High Street, 17th to 20th, and in their typical fashion of advertising and promoting their land, and all of their ads basically said, you're kicking yourself for not having bought in immediately preceding subdivision. Your last chance for a decent house site is whichever one we're developing now, and we'll use this same ad when we develop the next one. Axtell Heights was the one of the moment, and at Axtell Heights they had the additional attraction that you could get an auto ride from downtown Lincoln out to see Axtell Heights, and there would be aeroplane demonstrations overhead while you considered where to buy your land. Very convenient because just south of Axtell Heights at 20th and High Street was the aviation field that you can see crudely sketched in this view. And that was where the school on O Street did its flight training, and the most prominent of their pupils was Charles Lindbergh. And his first flights with his trainer would have been from the ground that later, soon after, became Woodsshire. I couldn't really claim that as part of the historic significance of Woodsshire, although I think it's fascinating and significant in all the vernacular uses of the term, because we can't really see the aviation field very clearly anymore unless we try to imagine it maybe on East Pershing. But there's a great plaque right at 20th and High remembering that, and I slipped it into the nomination as sort of an afterword just because it's too good to not put in. This is the kind of plain plat drawing that's filed with Register of Deeds for Woodsshire, laid out in 1925 towards the end of the year, 40 acres, a perfectly square portion of ground running from 17th to 20th and High down to what's labeled here, I think, Ponca, but we would know as Calvert on the south side. Very unusual in a Lincoln subdivision of that time in that half of the lots, the south lots and the east lots, face inward and turn only their backyard outward. The one place that the Woodses had begun to develop that idea was Woods Crest, where the 27th Street side and the Van Dorn side are the backs of those big lots, and they look completely inward. And they used that on two sides of Woodsshire. They developed small lots along 17th Street on the west and along High Street on the north, so that there was, as they typically did in their subdivisions, some range of offerings, that there were the big and more expensive lots where they required a higher priced house as the minimum, and there were some economic mix in the concept from the beginning by offering smaller and less expensive lots. They'd done that on Sheridan Boulevard as well. But far prettier than this drawing is Herminghaus's own beautiful drawing of the concept and realization of Woodsshire as a very special landscaped place. Through the Woods brothers, Herminghaus prepared an explanatory and advertising booklet to go along with the subdivision, published it in 1926, and this is the key drawing for the subdivision. He describes in it, in the booklet, that each lot would have a pair of elms in framing the house, but if we look along the east side of East Pershing, although he just calls it Pershing Road all the way around, we would call it West, South, and East Pershing. He's got a double row. We see very few of the elms anymore. There are a couple, and I'll feature them. That back row maybe was the pin oaks that we see today, because certainly we have pin oaks of very great age in many locations in Woodsshire. He used what he called round points at the key intersections, little tiny roundabouts, or what in my Boston experience they called rotaries. And then on what really was a ravine that ran through the west side from the southern end flowing down towards the northern end, he developed Woodsshire Park. He emphasized very strongly in his write-up that a key feature of the whole subdivision and of each lot was to work as much as possible with the existing topography, to alter the grade as little as possible. And in fact, in each deed, there was a requirement that if you altered the grade of a lot more than 2%, you had to have the approval of your neighbors and of the Woods brothers as well. Some early views. It's very convenient that Woodsshire was built immediately adjacent to Country Club, because whenever the Country Club flew to have photos recording their layout and the golf holes, we got a nice view up in the top of Woodsshire. This is about 1928, just at the very beginning of the development, and we can already see a scattering of houses on what we call West Pershing, a few on 17th, just a couple on East Pershing, and down on South Pershing. The street running down the middle is Grimsby Lane. Seems to me, even in the naming of it, wants to kind of establish a different character, and we'll see some of that character as we go along. Herminghaus's own house, where he selected and built in 1928, was right on the first round point off the diagonal entrance from 20th and High Streets on a very peculiar wedge-shaped piece of ground. He picked the pie slice on that round point to develop his house, and we'll look at that too. About the same time, but at this even clearer view, we can see they're already beginning to lay out the plantings in Woodsshire Park, and along the back between the properties, particularly on East Pershing and on Grimsby, we can see a little kind of dotted line. He describes in the booklet that lilacs should be planted along the back lines of all the properties separating the backyards. We can see the development of the round points, that they're already there. The Woods brothers typically, in these early subdivisions, put in as much of the infrastructure right from the beginning as they could. They boasted about that vociferously on Sheridan Boulevard, and they're clearly doing that expensive work of the landscaping of the park and the round points at the very beginning of this development. Also notice 20th Street doesn't go through at High, but rather runs along as just, if there was anything, it was just a dirt alley. We can see the line of, I think, a fence and the light pole or the electric poles running along. There really wasn't 20th separating the backyards of East Pershing on the east side from the country club property. It isn't really the golf course development where we're weaving houses among the holes, but those big lots did have then that openness onto the country club itself. I think I'd bring this back then to look at the development by 1941. Lots of, even though this is platted very near to the onset of the Great Depression, a lot of construction occurs during those years. I think we see, I think what Woodsshire demonstrates is that if you had means in the Depression with material and labor prices low, you could build in lovely fashion. And so we see quite a bit of development right in those last couple of years of the 20s, and then continuing on with quite a few houses developed in the 1930s. Now, zeroing in on some of the specific spaces and streets and then houses within Woodsshire, and there are about 120 contributing houses in my National Register nomination, and then just a handful, just about another fewer than a dozen that I had to regard as non-contributing just by their late date of construction. Ordinarily, properties built more recently than 50 years ago are not regarded as contributing to National Register. But Woodsshire has a very high degree of historic integrity. And I really felt like I was stretching on leaving a few of them out because they all contribute. And in fact, when I wrote up Lynn Jones's house, which I'll show you, I basically said, when it gets to be 50 years old, it's eligible too. This is the only sidewalk developed in the area. And Herminghaus talks about laying out narrow streets, not because he thought the street width itself was so important, but he didn't want to have that waste space that was so hard to handle between the curb and the sidewalk. He doesn't write about, so he therefore doesn't have sidewalks, but that in fact was the result, except on 17th, where then in this narrow space, a grand row of pin oaks are seemingly flourishing. The houses on South 17th are typically smaller. In the deeds for them, $5,000 was the required minimum for houses on High and South 17th, where $7,500, 50% more, was the required price for construction cost of houses in Woodsshire proper, or Woodsshire internal. It's all proper. In his booklet, Herminghaus said he didn't like governing house quality by price alone, and says there were so many examples around where it's lack of taste, not lack of means, that produced the houses. And so his recommended result was that he had the ability to supervise, that the Woods brothers have a committee of architects and their landscape architect to review the designs. They did not write that into the deeds, as happened in a few other areas, not very many in Lincoln. But in practice, as the Homeowners Association continued, there was a governing authority through the Homeowners Association in later years. Internal to Grimsby, just showing some of the smaller scale streets first, down towards the Round Point. The whole area slopes pretty sharply, although one doesn't really feel it on the streets. But if you look at the topographical map, high points on the south, sloping down to the north, and particularly down to the northwest corner where the park exits. There are two of these diagonal entry points. There are then entry points on the other side of the park, both roads lining the park, and Witham Lane on the west side. But two of them have the granite or the limestone entry posts, which are also contributing features to the development of the area, with this Woodsshire private residential park inscribed on each one. You'll notice if you focus on such things, the street signs are green, not blue, green and white, not blue and white, meaning while it's called private residential park, the streets were platted and dedicated as public streets, meaning the green signs. One of the four round points, as depicted by Herminghaus in his booklet, this is the northeast round point, just inside that 20th and High entrance. Shows both the geometric pattern that he laid out for the little circle itself, and then outlining it on all of them. He designed and then helped implement conifers, strengthening that circle on the outer rim. And a very early view, I've not found many views showing the first development up close. And this I pieced together from a home movie that Sue Blackman shared, that we could, it sweeps across the round point, so I could capture and kind of pin it together. And we see that it did have that very formal development of low, probably boxwood hedges, and then a very conical conifer in each one, and just a little suggestion, it's hard to see through it, that it had the circular outer border of conifers as well. And then each of those is maintained today, none of them in as extravagant fashion as he first laid out, but maintaining the geometric patterns, maintaining the hedges, and typically deciduous hedges and coniferous trees, while he drew, and you'll see in several of them, ornaments of a fountain or an urn. I haven't seen any evidence that any of those were actually installed, but rather a street, one of the handsome fluted street lamps in the middle of each one. On that round point was Herminghaus's own house, and that was this Tudor Revival design at 1946 Kings Highway of 1928. It's attributed, or it's identified on its building permit as designed by Davis and Wilson. It's also attributed to Bruce Hazen, and Bruce Hazen was a very prolific residential architect in Lincoln, and the busiest residential architect in Woodsshire. Probably both are correct in that Bruce Hazen at this time, 1928, was working at Davis and Wilson, and later he was working for McGinnis and Schomburg, but he's identified individually on many of the building permits. This one, permit says Davis and Wilson, oral history says Bruce Hazen, probably just amplifying the same facts. We can see the early planting of the conifers tracing the segmental curve of the outer edge of the round point there. And I suppose probably Herminghaus's car pulled up to the garage. A front garage because this lot came to a point at the back. This was in that layout with pretty conventional lots along High Street, and then the diagonal road coming in and Kings Highway to the other side. One lot had to be squeezed down into a little point, and that's the one he picked, where he could lay out brick walls with almost a church-like apse at the back of his garden, and then these lovely little hedges outlining it. Supposedly he had irrigation built into that wall at the top to keep his garden lush, and this was his home from 28 for about a decade until the end of the 1930s. today beautifully maintained by Janet Blackman. Southeast Round Point, just down the other end of East Pershing from the first one, is maintained with a higher hedge, and in his drawing he has not only that hedges outlining the four verticals, but then a flower bed outside of that, I would guess beyond the means of the homeowner association to maintain the flower beds as well as the rest of that round point. But beautiful little spot still, not with the, I think, fountain that he's depicting in the center, but the street light. These are still maintained by the homeowners association. The owners in Woodsshire contribute annually for the overall maintenance of the round points and of the park. Northwest Round Point, and that's the one up at the center of Kings Highway. Beautiful spot where Kings Highway's sloping down from east to west, and Grimsby's leading down into it. We're looking down Grimsby on the on both of these views, and has the tallest and narrowest of the great columnar trees. And I think while he's depicting, I think it's a dozen planted in that little circle, like the effect is still very strong, and his design intent is carried out very well today in the present treatment. This is also one that depicts the changing evolution and that's necessary in maintaining landscape design, that a few of the old Austrian pines survive on one side of this, getting to be in fairly late years, probably in their lifespan. The newer plantings in a couple different sequences, because you can see by the age of the trees, are reestablishing in other hopefully healthier varieties that columnar circle still on the outer edge. At the top of Woodsshire Park, he inscribed a very large circle, which he called the play circle, and outlined it with trees and a hedge, and it's still outlined in a full circle of trees, but not the hedge. And this was his kind of more active recreation space, focused for children, up at the top of the circle. And then along the length of it, he describes massing plantings, not in, and massing them in a few varieties, that this was not to be an arboretum of every possible species, but for larger effect, he would group the plantings. And he describes that this park, unlike most, he was designing to be seen driving by, because it's really, in its long linear character, he's dressing up a ravine in beautiful fashion, but that he's not really designing it for being inside the space, but for driving by the space. It's also a nice space to be inside, so it's not like it doesn't do that. They also, in the layout, put very narrow streets to either side of it, feeling almost, they are two-way, but they feel rather like one-way, with the open on the park side and then parking and the houses along Woodsshire and West Pershing. He also, in his aerial perspective from the south, shows us that he's lined up that park, or he's capitalized on what the park offers by providing a capital view, which I think we'd probably have to cut down a lot of trees in between now to fully enjoy, but that he's oriented the park towards the state capitol tower, which is about to be built. And he does this a couple times in his career, where he's so conscious of that beautiful feature that will grow up on the horizon and that will be such a major feature of the Lincoln urban design, that he designs Woodsshire Park and features at Pioneers Park to capitalize on a tower that isn't there yet. So very strong sense of his place and how he can integrate his landscape design into the bigger urban design of the city. These are some of those massings of Norway spruce along the west side of the park on West Pershing, and a view across the turf, the middle, over to one of the. It's worth visiting Woodsshire in many seasons, but fall for the pin oaks is particularly spectacular. A few more of those pin oaks on East Pershing. And on Grimsby, where it gets narrower, both in the yard size and the street, they become amazing plants in that setting. Now, focusing all the way down to a few of the houses, we have still surviving in the house the drawings for Carl Norden's house by McGinnis and Schomburg, prominent Lincoln architects of many building types, from Irving Junior High to the Federal Trust Building on South 13th, and this lovely Tudor Revival house, and also an early, now faded, but still you can see a little of the hand tinting for this early photograph of that house, with its young plantings of the elms that Herminghaus had in mind, and the hedges within the lot. The border hedge is gone, but that one grand old elm still hanging on. And some of the early features we see, and some that survive. Wonderful house of yellow brick that the mortar's not raked back, but extruded, or I think the proper term would be squished, giving it this really rich texture. And one of my favorite things about the house is I can't always in every neighborhood reliably have a black squirrel appear when I give a walking tour, but this house allows me always to have one when I give a tour of Woodsshire, carved in the varge boards way up at the top. And a fall view of that elm losing its yellow leaves. There is another elm, I think there are 2 or 3 more still surviving in the neighborhood, but very few. One further north on East Pershing in front of one of the later post-World War II houses. Looking quickly at some of the architectural styles of the neighborhood, I haven't found anything that matches the kind of popular rumor, and I think it is published in the WPA Lincoln City Guide, that it was required that houses be built in the English style. That seems to be very broad when you've got colonial revival, although I guess we were English then, and lots of Tudor, but we also have several other styles. But mostly, I think it is fair to look at Woodsshire as a 3-dimensional pattern book of period revival, middle third of the 20th century. Lovely houses. Lovely enough that Schomburg and McGinnis were not only busy in the neighborhood, but Schomburg provided himself 2 houses in the neighborhood, both on East Pershing. In 1927, he built at 3240 East Pershing in a Tudor. And then about a decade later, moves just down the block and provides himself a little more formal, sort of maybe French provincial towards the end of the 30s. Lots of lovely Tudor throughout the neighborhood. This is William Hawes' house on Kings Highway of 28. And many of the most interesting houses, well, we've got lots of architect-designed houses in Woodsshire. Many of the very fine houses do not have any architect identified with them, and whether the builder was obtaining plans somewhere else, or some of these builders, I think, were familiar enough through their work that they may have been self-designing some of these grand houses. 3320 East Pershing not only has the great oaks, but one of the grandest of the French eclectic houses. And this one, Frank Roby, again, is identified as contractor, and no architect is listed on the building permits nor in the published photo in the Journal Star of 1932. With that real high conical roof and the varied window sizes, and often that sort of little favorite trick of pushing a window up through the eaves are all what McAllister's term French eclectic. And here in a really great limestone. Another French eclectic, and this one right up at the west end of East Pershing, more symmetrical, but still with that very big, tall hip roof, and this one ornamented with the rounded dormers. Austin Marker Construction, who often were doing the largest commercial projects, are identified on the building permit for Timothy and Edith Farrell's house. Hazen, who had done the Tudor revival for Herminghaus, most often appears in Woodshire in great colonial examples, like this one on Grimsby for Moses Hollingworth. Lots of other great colonial as well. This another on Grimsby for Benjamin and Sadie Finkelstein, and that was Ben of Ben's Auto, Mr. Finkelstein. And Felix Lorenz, who was a builder and sometimes architect from College View, is identified on this permit. We see him throughout Lincoln and near South. He was the architect of the Christian Record Building down on South 48th across from Union College. They're doing his most modern Art Deco, but here a very lovely colonial revival. Fulliger is a prolific builder throughout Lincoln, and we see him on several large and small houses in Woodshire. Here on High Street in 29, he built for the Woods Brothers. I think they may have been trying to kind of prime development on High Street. We don't see much development on High, much more on South 17th in the first few years, and then it catches up. Post-World War II, a large percentage of the houses remain in the period revival styles, but about 20% of the houses in the neighborhood built after World War II are developed in what we would call ranch style, very horizontal, single story. This one of the most extended by the particular lot it had available in the 50s and early 40s and early 50s. In materials, very similar to brick, typically brick and limestone, to the earlier houses or their period revival neighbors being built around them at the same time. And I regard these as contributing to the character of the area. They are the final development in the neighborhood. A couple of very special houses. The Miles house at the very the very southeast corner of Woodshire, built in 1952, and designed an early project of the Clark and Enerson firm, doing an international style house in a period revival neighborhood, and doing it in very interesting fashion. This was a photo just a couple years old, and you can see somebody along the way had wanted maybe for a pickup truck or something, they needed a higher garage door. The current owners are doing a beautiful job with the house, including realigning the tops of those garage doors, which is such a subtle thing, but really strengthens, I think, the international style flavor of the house. The entry is this long entry that kind of comes down between two wings of the house. And it sits right beside the pedestrian way that was provided in the original plat and in Herminghaus's early drawing for pedestrians, and particularly I see it as the school children coming out of the neighborhood on the south side where there's no street to access Calvert and Beatty School just across to the west. This is the external corner of Woodsshire from the southeast and the backside of that Clark and Anderson house, looking rather different from what you see as you're inside Woodsshire, but I think great integrity to that house, particularly as it's being handled today. And then probably the ranking anomaly in design in the neighborhood, Lynn and Linda Jones's house of 1972. Linda describes that Lynn's first design was very horizontal and was turned down. So he took the comments and came back with a very vertical design. And as a young mother, she made sure that the lot they were buying, they could build their house on, and they got underway. Lovely example of what we would call a shed-style house of the mid-'70s, like as pure an example as we have in Lincoln. And as you taking it out of context here, it clearly looks different than what we've been seeing as you go along the street. I think it's a nice neighbor on the street, partly because we know what lovely people live in it too. And this is the one I wrote up as saying, when we get to 1972 plus 50, we can evaluate this as for being a great house of its moment. Now to wrap up Mr. Herminghaus just briefly, after Woodsshire, he goes on to other very significant projects, one of them being Pioneers Park, that 500 plus acres that the city had received from the Harris brothers in honor of their pioneer parents. In his title block for the park, he pays homage to Goodhue and the bison on the north face of the Capitol steps. 1929, his depiction of the east 80 acres, the east entry point to the park with the roundabout and the meandering roads, and then Goodhue Capitol is visible inscribed on that view. He's, on paper, it looks like he's cutting through the pine forest, that pine forest that of course surrounds Lincoln. He's got bare prairie and he's planting very deliberately to create these vistas. A little more the working drawing for that, and the kind of vista that he then created with the pines lining his prairie to tell you where to look and what to see. And great view it is. An early postcard of the Bison Circle, that east entry point. And it looks so clean and perfect, but notice they haven't filled in that gap in the hedge. Doesn't look nearly as clean and perfect in the black and white photo. And in the droughts of the early 30s, they planted and replanted Pioneers Park multiple times, probably not even really objecting, because much of the purpose of Pioneers in the early days was to provide work. And it was a major work relief project of the New Deal and of city programs to get people out in the fresh air and planting pioneers, digging up the dead pines, planting more of them. In his drawing, some very fanciful features near the center that weren't developed, a more formal mall, a little zoo feature, summer cottages, swimming pool, and at the far end he did have bigger ponds where the nature center was developed. He prepared drawings in the Capitol vicinity, both for the environs, and this was his drawing for South 15th Street with very formal plantings along those long islands. And we can see spirea and Colorado spruce, barberries at the ends. And much of this, at least initially, was implemented, and we see some of it in the postcard views of the time. And in the Capitol grounds itself were a major project for the landscaping of the Great Goodhue Square. We can see in this 1941 view some of the placement with the continuous rows of concolor firs lining the north and south entrances, and then very careful clusters of trees out on the grounds so that he's opening and closing views very deliberately, not to mask the building. And in this postcard we see some of that developed with the tall columnar trees at both the entrances, and then occasional along the foundation, but not at all blocking the foundation view. And we see some of that developed in this later postcard. And I've not gone back to capture all of the replanting of it, but the Herminghaus concepts are driving the current landscape plan and are part of the National Historic Landmark designation of the Capitol. The grounds are included in the Herminghaus work, is cited directly within that. So a quick look at a very productive career in Lincoln and a neighborhood that I think really was his centerpiece as probably the finest of the residential neighborhoods he developed, and the one in which he also chose to live for a decade. With that, I'd be happy to take questions if you have them. I'll make up answers. Bob?
Question on the nice rendering that Herminghaus did for the Woods Company for promotion purposes, the plan. It shows a half a dozen sites within the plan more fully developed. Do you have any sense of whether whether those houses were built first as kind of show homes? I mean, they're kind of strategically placed at the corners or the entry points of the plan. Like Herminghaus's site, for instance, is pretty fully developed, shows a house on it. Due east across it, there's a large site that's more fully developed. There's a couple by the 17th Street diagonal entrance. And there's one where High Street comes into Kings Highway right there, and one down in the southwest corner as well. I just wondered if those homes were perhaps the first developed, or they were deliberately developed to provide some sort of sense of space and scale. Or
Bob's asking about those examples in the drawing where Herminghaus has indicated a more full development of an individual lot. And I've looked at that, but not really looked into it. I think the one example that probably was carried out was his own, because I think we see some of that development, how he was treating that pie slice of a backyard. I'm not sure we'd see any of the others. And I know just as I look at particularly the ones up on the north end of the park, mostly those developed much later. The ones on the diagonal entrance adjacent his house, there's some very interesting development there, but I don't know that it reflected his drawing here. Much in his booklet seems to be Herminghaus telling the Woods brothers and future buyers how he would like to see it happen. But the Woods brothers, while they implement this beautiful design, don't take all of his very particular advice, where he's saying, don't govern by minimum price. They write minimum price into the covenants. And I would guess he had an ongoing influence as the designer sitting at the top of East Pershing there. And you see like a character at East Pershing and a deep setback that you would assume is written into the covenants. It's not. So there was a pattern working along there that I think was probably his ongoing influence.
Where in that would you put the airfield?
My guess is the airfield must have been along roughly East Pershing, because I think that's the highest and flattest portion, and it really starts to slope off pretty strongly towards the north and the west. So I think where the photo, or where the little sketch bird's eye view showed little plains up near the northeast corner, I think that probably was not too far, and then probably extending down along the east side.
I'm guessing too, with the prevailing wind on the south, they'd want to start low on the north and head south and go uphill, pick up a headwind and get a little better lift.
And they mostly got up and down again safely, so they probably were conscious of both prevailing wind and getting up and down. Thank you very much.